Welcome, welcome to everybody. I can see a few of your faces. It's a pleasure to recognize some of you and to see some new people. If you can, I would really appreciate it if you could put yourselves on camera. I know many people prefer not to. It gives you a certain freedom, I suppose. But you know, I don't mind if you get up and down, and I won't be distracted if you want to move around. But to see your faces is really a very big thing for me. So if you can, I want to make a couple of business, what do they call it, housekeeping comments, first of all. One is that this shiur is for an hour and a half, not an hour and a quarter. So we will be working from 5 to 6:30. That's one thing. Another thing is if you can bring a chumash with you every time. I generally, on the source sheet, I put the secondary sources. I put the commentaries and the midrashic sources, but the actual sources in the Torah itself, I prefer to have you just look up whenever I quote them. So if you could bring a chumash. Also, there is a chat here, and I warmly invite you, if it helps you, to share your thoughts on the chat so that other people can react to them. That I think tends to make one feel more part of a real class. On the other hand, I will not be able to look at the chat because I need all my concentration for what I'm trying to say. So that takes all my brain power. I can't really spare the attention to look at the chat. If we finish a little early, I will have a look at the chat and perhaps bring up one or two of your questions. In any case, even if I don't deal with your questions, please feel free to write to me. You can easily get my email address and to ask me any questions or discuss points further. That's a sign of extraordinary dedication if you do that. Also, yes, you have sources. You have source materials, yes, which I suppose you've printed up, and I will be referring to them off screen. You can look at your sources while I'm talking. I will look at mine and you'll look at yours. Okay, I think we're ready to start now. So what I want to think about today is the strange fact, which it's very blatant every year, the teaching year, that we start our study of the Torah not with Bereshit, but with Noach. And that's, you might say, that's an accident of the calendar. It so happens that Bereshit it's still part of the Chagim, as it were, and we begin after. But it is a strange paradox that we don't begin our study with the story of creation, with the beauty and goodness and very goodness of the story of creation, but rather we begin with destruction. And that already in some way begins to dovetail with my general title of trauma. As if no sooner has the world got breathing, no sooner has it begun, well, it's actually a few hundred years, it's not so soon. But in terms of the text, we begin to study at the moment when God, Vayinachem, changes his mind about having created the human being on the earth. That's what we read. And so I want to start by looking at that first movement of dissatisfaction on God's part with what he has created, with the human life, the human being and his descendants, whom he has created with great hopes and great intentions. This was the human being who was going to be B'Tselem Elokim, who was made in some sense in the image of God. And it doesn't take very long, a mere 10 generations. What is that in the perspective of eternity? It doesn't take very long before God is saying this. First of all, I'm looking at in the Torah, chapter 6, verse 6. Vayar Hashem ki rabba ra'at ha'adam ba'aretz, and God saw that the evil of the human being on the earth was great, was plentiful, was overflowing in some sense. L'chol yetzer machshavot libo rak ra kol hayom, and all the intentions of the thoughts of his heart, all the products of the thoughts of his heart, all his creativity, almost his libidinal impulses are only evil all day long. Now that's a very blanket charge against human beings on the earth. It's totally evil all day long. Vayinachem Hashem ki asa et ha'adam ba'aretz. And God changed his mind. That's how it's usually understood. Vayinachem. He thinks of his original hopes in creating the human being on the earth. Vayitatsev el libo. I don't know if you feel that the really strange new tonality that we read in these words. Suddenly you have a sense of God disappointed, you might say, and saddened to his heart. Vayitatsev el libo. A very intense way of talking about God's emotional life, which in general the Torah doesn't share with us. Right? I've tried to think, when do we hear about God's emotions, kaviyachol, as it were? Well, on the whole, if I think about it, it tends to be in terms of God's anger. That's the one emotion that a God, is understood. It goes along with the divine territory. That gods are angry. Gods are angry with those they've created. They think human beings don't behave well. Anger is within the accepted vocabulary. But here the idea of a certain kind of sadness, a reflexive sadness, as if God is thinking about being sad. It makes him sad that he's sad, something like that. It's the hitpael form, right? It's a particular form that gives you that sense of a kind of complexity of layers of God's experience. And he is disappointed, he is saddened to his heart. What then follows? God then says, Emche et ha'adam, so I'm going to wipe out, I'm going to annihilate. It sounds very decisive and very total. I'm going to annihilate the human being. That's the object of God's disappointment, whom I have created. I'm going to wipe him out from the whole face of the whole surface of the earth. And then it turns out it's not just the human being. As God is declaring his intention, he's already altering it. And I want to show that this is really quite, I don't know if you pick it up already. This is not what we might have expected of the magisterial language of God. When God makes a decision, it's a decision, right? He just says it like a psak din, it would be like a verdict. This is how it is, impersonal. He doesn't have to express emotion. He doesn't have to go through changes. All these things humanize the expressions here, almost to the point of scandal. It's almost scandalous. What do we have here? God says, first of all, I'll wipe out the human being. And then, me adam va'ad behema ad remes. No, it's not just the human being. It's the human being to the cattle, to the crawling creatures, to all the birds of the heaven. Ki nichamti ki asitim. Because again, there's that word, which usually means comfort, and here means regret. I regret that I have made them. And them, does that mean the human being? Does it mean everything that God is going to wipe out? It's a little open, but it probably means everything. So it's almost as if God, like a human being, is thinking while he's speaking. Right? That's really what human speech is. That as we talk, we are thinking what we're about to say next, or we're bumping into our own words, something more like that. That we say something, and then we begin to realize, oh, I mean more than that, or I mean something slightly different. So we're constantly improvising as we're speaking. And that improvised quality, right, that improvised quality is there in God's voice here, in the way that God is speaking. He adjusts what he's saying as he says it. And in the end, he says in the first person what we've heard about him in the third person, that he regrets. Now that's a word, vayinachem, nichamti. He says it in the first person now, as if we are really being let into the innermost feelings of God, the most intimate feeling. It's not just that the narrator is telling us that God is sorry he created human beings, but now it comes through with the sincerity and passion of God's own words. God is in a passion of some kind. Would you please mute yourselves? Thank you. And so we have here that blanket intention to destroy everything. And then there is this last little comment, which ends Parashat Bereshit, ends last week's Parsha. V'Noach matzah chen b'einei Hashem. And the narrator just puts in a quick last half sentence before we leave the Parsha. You know, Noach found favor in the eyes of God. In plain English, that is, God liked Noach. Right? It's a pretty satisfactory translation, although the Hebrew is more poetic, to find favor in the eyes. Basically, it means God liked Noach. Now, what's that sudden interpolation there, that sudden additional verse? It's not as if God has declared in all the dignity of his divine being, Noach is a righteous person, and therefore he will be the exception to the, I now judge that he will not be included in the destruction. Everyone but him. No. God says everyone and everything. And then the narrator adds a little addendum, a little NB at the end. Oh, by the way, you should know that that God liked Noach. In other words, Noach is not going to be included. Now do you feel what I'm trying to get across here? That there's a kind of improvised quality to how God speaks. It gives us a sense here of God as an anthropomorphic sense of God. That's the usual word for it. But that's a very cold word. That's a very technical word. That we are asked to relate to God speaking here and intending to destroy in a very human mode, in a mode of changeability, perhaps even of uncertainty, of thinking on one's feet, right? It's almost, I would say, it lacks dignity, right? Where is the dignity of God in this speech? And this is what will continue as we move then into Parashat Noach. One thing that I want to point out that seems very, very interesting carrying on in this vein is that there seems to be really a kind of ambivalence. It says Vayinachem. How do we translate that? Normally we understand Nechama as comfort. And a lot of the Midrashic sources, the Midrashic literature tries many different ways to translate the word Vayinachem here. But on the whole, we go against the usual meaning of the word Vayinachem. You think you know what Nechama is? Here it means something different. Here it means Nimlach malasot. Nimlach, this is Rashi. I didn't put it on your page. God thought to himself, or he took counsel, Nimlach. Nimlach is in the passive, almost as if he's consulting. He's consulting with whom? With the angels? With the other heavenly beings? That's one midrashic thought. That already we've met in the creation story. There too, what God says, Na'aseh Adam, let us make man. Instead of being an unequivocal, absolute, divine intention of omnipotence, the omnipotent God who says, man, now let man come into being, there's almost a tentative quality about it. Shall we? Shall we make God, shall we make man? Almost in a kind of, it's a rhetorical question, but maybe not so rhetorical. And so the Midrash will say, no, you consulted the angels, and some angels were in favor and other angels were against. And suddenly you have a sense of a conflict of some kind that God has to contain in himself. Why doesn't he just ignore the angels and do what he wanted to do? But instead, he first of all consults them and he hears the different points of view. Right? It's very anthropomorphic. And then he decides, in a rather decisive way, actually, he throws one angel, the angel of truth, down to earth, because truth can never be in favor of the human being. Human being and truth have very embarrassing relationships with each other. So God decides, but at first, it seems, he opens himself up to a complexity of thought. Shall we do it? Shall we? Shan't we? What shall we do? And there is, of course, the plural person there. Shall we? We shall. And what you have here is something rather similar. Just before God looks at the evil of the human world, we read a very mysterious verse. If you have a Chumash in front of you, you can follow. It's chapter 6, verse 3. After a very enigmatic story about the sons of God and the daughters of man and some kind of relationship between them that obviously is not good. And then God says, Lo yadon ruchi ba'adam le'olam. Very difficult to translate. Literally, my spirit will not judge human beings forever. But that doesn't make any sense. And Rashi translates this really quite extraordinarily. He translates it. You see if I have it written here? Yes. He says what God is saying here. What God is saying here, find the quote.
Notes.
Anyone have Rashi in front of you?
I don't know how to find it.
Chapter.
Yeah, I have it.
You have it. All right. Chapter 6, verse 3.
Lo
What an extraordinary statement. God is saying, let me not be thrown into turmoil and conflict about the human being. That will not go on forever. I have to make a decision about the human being. As if God finds himself, lo yadun means to have a discussion. I'm constantly having internal discussions. Not necessarily, leave the angels out of it now. Inside God, apparently there's a conflict. Shall we or shan't we? Shall we be mashchit or shall we be merachem? Whether to destroy or whether to have compassion. And so you have what I'm calling an ambivalence, which is, raises one's eyebrows a little, but it's certainly interesting that God is shown. That's how the Torah tells the story. If we read through Rashi and through the Midrash, of a God who is not decided, he is not yet decided. Things still remain hesitant, undecided, vital. By vital, I mean alive. The issues remain alive, and the issues remain alive as long as you are in two minds about something. That's when you can begin to dream and worry and have reveries. Like the full life of a human being comes into play when you've not made up your mind. If you are a very decisive person, if you are a godlike person, if you are an omnipotent person, then that may be very helpful in some ways, but you also lose a great deal if you're very quick to make up your mind. You haven't exposed yourself to all the complexity of what can be thought about any particular issue or problem. And God is described in the Midrash as someone who has a complex inner life. What he says is, Emche et ha'adam. I'm going to wipe out. Sounds very absolute. Emche. Except that it's not a good translation. What is emche actually? Rashi comments on that too. It's not a dry obliteration, it's a wet annihilation. Limchot is to flood in itself. It means to add water, for instance, to solid material and mix it around and make a paste. Right? That's how Rashi translates it. Umachiti. Right? The human being is made of dust, right? This is really mythic, right? It's mythic language. Human being was made of dust, remember, the dust of the earth. I will add water to him, avi alav mayim, and I'll add so much water that all his fibers will, right? All the fibers of creation, everything that's gone to make the creation of the world into forms and shapes and meanings, and this is separate from that. The heavens from the earth, they are separated from the earth. Yehirakia, God said. Let there be a firmament in the mass of the water, a division, mavdil, and it will divide between the upper waters and the lower waters. In other words, it won't be one mass of water. We will differentiate. That was what creation meant, to make a division, a separation, so you can now see, this is earth, this is light, that is darkness, and so on and so on. The word lehavdil occurs over and over again to distinguish, to differentiate when God is creating the world. But now that he intends to destroy it, how does he do it? Through the simple device of adding water, right? Your chemical imagination is called on here, right? You're called here, almost it's like being in a chemistry lab. How is God going to do it? He's doing it in the way you deal with solid matter, which has a shape and a form, that you flood it with water. You bring lots of water into it, and in the end, it decomposes, right? Isn't that, in a sense, not to be too gruesome, isn't that what happens to the dead body? Just without any interference. The dead body, I don't want to evoke such macabre thoughts, what happens when the dead body decomposes is that there's a lot of liquid that forms. There's a lot of liquid that forms in the body, and everything decomposes. And so, wipe your minds clean of that image. But that is what God is saying. I originally made him from dust, and all I will do now is just add some water. Water is the destructive medium, and lots of water, and everything will fall apart. From creating the world to deconstructing the world. Everything was clear and specific when I created the world. Every different kind of tree, every different kind of animal, everything was there in its full outlines, clear outlines. All I'm going to do is reduce the whole thing to one mess. Lashon michui, as Rashi says. Michui is like the modern Hebrew word machit. Sorry again, but that my whole share today is going to be on this level of the way imagery makes us think of things we wouldn't otherwise have thought of. In modern Hebrew, we talk about mashed potatoes. Yes, how do you mash potatoes? Starts off as, fairly firm potatoes. It's a little bit soft. And then the idea is to soften it. And you soften it with milk or with egg or with water, something liquid. And then if you add more and more of the liquid, then you completely lose the solid consistency, and you can no longer tell it's potatoes. It just becomes one mess. So of course, it's a question of how much water. Was Adam created only from dust, the dust of the earth? Do you remember? Vayitzer Hashem Elokim et Adam. Chapter 2, verse 7. What did we read there? The Lord God formed, there's the idea of forming of the human being, afar min ha'adama, dust from the earth. So that does sound right. But how do you form dry dust? Dry dust will not form. You need liquid in order to mold it, in order to work with it. Yes, and Rashi comments on that. The idea that God here is forming with his two hands, right? Actually using his hands. He is forming the human being, right? It's very anthropomorphic. The human being, where does the liquid come from? And if you glance back just before that, we have this very powerful and strange passage, which I want to return to later, verse 5 onwards, describing the process of creating the human being. There was no longer, we have got to a certain point in creation. What day is it? When there was no vegetation or grass clothing the earth. Nothing had yet sprung up. Nothing had sprouted. Why not? Because there hadn't yet been any rain on the earth. And there was no human being to till the ground. Now, all that was before there was a human being. But then what happened? A vapor rose up from the earth and irrigated the whole face of the earth. And then God could form from the dust of the earth, he could form the human being. Now, clearly there is symbolism here. There's something about these very physical descriptions of how the human being is created that has significance. Water has an essential role in making it possible to create the human being. And the creation of the human being, and this is what I want to come back to later, has everything to do with the growth of the vegetation on the earth. There can be no vegetation until there is a human being. Let me just say one word of the Rashi that we will look at later. There can be no vegetation until there is a human being to recognize the goodness of vegetation, to recognize that we need vegetation. And therefore, till there's a human being who can recognize what he doesn't have, who recognize what's missing in the world, and can pray for it. That's what Rashi will go on to say. If you want to have a look at it now, you can see it in number 6 on the page, but I will come back to that later. So before the human being is created, in a sense, creation is stalled. On the 3rd day already, God said, let the earth be covered with vegetation. And then we find out that actually the grass grew, but just up to the edge, the surface of the earth. It didn't emerge from the surface of the earth. It was stalled because you need a human being to pray it into existence. That's what Rashi will say. You need a human being to recognize the absence of what should be here. How does Adam know? How does Adam know that we need vegetation? He hasn't taken botany lessons. He hasn't studied anything of this kind. But apparently that is what the human being is. Adam Ayin, there is no human being. That is, the human being is someone who knows what is not. We are very good at recognizing what's missing. In other words, we have desire. In other words, we see the potential that is not being fulfilled. And once we see it, right, we're very good. Right, the negative side of that is that we're very good at complaining, at seeing what's not there. The positive side of that is to recognize that this can't be the will of God. God said there should be vegetation. Obviously, there has to be vegetation. Why is it stalled? Maybe I'm needed. Maybe I need to pray for it. I need to want it to be in order for it actually to come to be. Well, I've more or less covered that, Rashi, but we'll still come back to it. In other words, coming back to our point, what we have then is the original creation of the human being needed water. It had, the dust of the earth was there. It needed water. Later, when God wants to destroy the human being, he says, I'll just add water. Emche, that word macha means to deconstruct, to decompose, to add water, to add liquid, so that the shape, the tselem, the demut of the human being is lost, is completely turns to water. It's a kind of horrifying image again. That's all it took. Mabul mayim. And again there, when God brings, he says, I will bring a flood of water. Rashi there too will ask. He pushes us constantly into this mythic direction. He says, it could have been, he is basing himself on a whole tradition of discussion in the Midrash. It could have been a mabul, a force, a surge of some other element, like fire. Let's say fires could have broken out. A mabul ish. No, it was a mabul mayim. It's made very specific here because you're supposed to imagine the effect of water on solid forms. Yes, and how you need some water, but if you flood it with water, that's the end of it. Similarly, when God announces, when God brings the flood, actually later, what do we have? Talking about de-differentiation. It's chapter 7, verse 11. It's a description of the flooding of the world with water. The flooding of the world with water. Chapter 7, verse 11. Yes. On the 600th year of the life of Noah, it's the date of the actual flood is is correlated to Noah's life. It all has to do with him, with something to do with his experience. But on that very day, the date is given, Nifku'u kol mayanot tehom rabbah, all the fountains of the great deep were split through. In other words, everything, the fountains were gushed forth. Suddenly you have an explosion of water from those fountains. They're not contained anymore. So they come bursting through the earth. Kol mai, all the fountains of the deep. Ve'arubot hashamayim niftachu. And the windows of the heaven were opened up. Now look what you have then. What God did in creating the world was to create a barrier between the upper waters in the heavens and the under earth waters, what's underneath the earth, so that you should have dry land, the creation of dry land, with all its meanings of meaning, right? Once you have a dry land, then you can have civilization, and you can have form and shape and all the things that we associate with civilized life in a humanized world. But then when God wants to destroy, all he has to do is let those geysers have come up with full force. I was once in New Zealand and became aware of the terror of the underworld, that if you walk unwisely, if you don't notice warning signs, you could be stepping into geyser territory, exactly where, and of course that would be fatal. So somewhere a sense that there are parts of the world in which you're very aware that you're walking on a thin crust with liquid underneath. This is putting it very geologically. But of course, all this I want to suggest and gradually build up the imagery. All this is to suggest something about the human imagination, about Yetzer Lev Adam, which is somehow connected with God's understanding of that human heart, that God too thinks in this kind of imagery. So now what you have is that the upper and lower waters are reunited once more. It's all one mass of water now, and that's the end of creation. Now, these images, these very difficult images, have to do with a sadness that besets God. When God decides to let these forces gush up and surge down and overcome the fragile creation of forms and meanings, when God decides that, it's with great sadness. And I want to have a look with you now at the first 4 sources on your page, very, very quickly, that all have to do with that root, vayit atzev. And he was saddened to his heart. He was saddened to his heart. What do we have here? Let's start with number 2. It's number 1A, B, C, and D, right? So I'll read and translate the Hebrew, and you can follow in whatever language is comfortable for you. This is all Rashi. Rashi, first of all, and let's start with 1B. Rashi on, you shall eat of the grass of the field. That's part of the curse that God gives to man, the original man, in the very first episode of things going wrong. God had created the human being, Vayar ki tov ma'od, he saw it was very good. And then immediately, as the Midrash puts it, before Shabbat can come, of the 6th day, man has already decomposed in some sense. He's already reduced, he's already diminished. He begins to, it's a terrible image of man just reducing his cellar. And what do we have there? There are various curses. Arurah adamah b'avurecha. Cursed be the ground for you, because of you. It's not only you who will be cursed, but the ground. And so Rashi asks the question, what is so terrible about having to eat of the vegetation of the earth? You can actually eat quite a healthy diet based on vegetables and plant food and so on. Ma'amur kan baroshas, but what does it say then, right? I've given God mentioned that originally. I'm giving you all the trees that bear seed. I'm sorry, all the grass, the vegetation that bears seed. In other words, that's part of the blessing of creation. So what is the curse of the earth? for your sake, be'itzavon tochalena. The word the Torah uses is, you shall eat of the grass of the field in itzavon. And we don't quite know what itzavon is. Sadness. It's not etzev, the usual word for sadness. It's a specialized form of sadness. Right? It's a kind of, it's those who know about feelings, right? Those who have feelings know there's a particular shade of feeling. That's called itzavon here, which Rashi describes here. He says, how does it feel? What is this scenario that arouses this kind of sadness? The kotz v'dardar tatzmiach lecha, that the earth will raise for you thorns and thistles when you have sown all kinds of good vegetables and pulse and all kinds of grains and things that you've sown in the earth and you've expected to get a nourishing. This is a question now of the human creativity, of human beings using their hands in the earth, right? The primal relationship with the earth is through the hands. The original plow, in a sense, is the human hand before plows were invented. So human beings get their hands into the earth, as you know, if you've ever had a vegetable plot, and they imagine what's going to grow here. They put in the right kind of seeds. And then what does the earth give you back? Thorns and thistles. That's called cursed be the earth. In other words, it's not a matter of the objective product of the earth. Right? If I planted thorns and thistles, then I wouldn't be surprised if it brought up thorns and thistles. But because I had dreams and expectations and desires, and I knew how to, and my hands knew what they were doing, and then suddenly I get this slap in the face, this frustration of finding thorns and thistles and being obliged to eat thorns and thistles, delicious as it may be if I know how to cook it, I still feel, what's the word then for itzavon in this interpretation? I suppose something like frustration, disappointment. Nitabel alovdan maaseh yadav. Have a look at the last, at number 1D, the last of these subsections in number 1, coming back to God. When God was saddened to his heart, what's the comment Rashi makes about that? What is this kind of sadness? He mourned the loss of the work of his hands. That is, it's not just, what can I put it? This is God's creative activity. The acme, the climax of God's creative activity is the human being, in which God, in a sense, represents himself. Tselem Elokim, right? That's part of the plan, right? As God is creating the human being, that is the plan. And here we must think of human beings now when we create something, right? Even if we make a cake, we are already planning with all the ingredients how the whole thing is going to be, how it's going to taste, and how it's going to look, and how it's going to smell, how it will connect with me. It will really arise from my dream of the ideal cake, to be very prosaic. If I write a poem, yes, if I write music, I put tremendous effort into it, and if it's no good, right, that the insult of one's creativity turning bad. Suddenly you look at what came out of your hands, and it's a particularly poignant and unbearable, really unbearable form of disappointment, which we are now being let into by Rashi on each time the word itzavon is used in these early chapters. So now we can go back to 1a, fill in here. God says to Eve, to Chava, when he curses her curse in the Garden of Eden, when for having seduced Adam to eat the fruit, he says to her, Harba arbe itzponech, I will greatly increase your itzavon. Be'etzev tildi banim. And then the other word, etzev, is used. You will give birth to children in sadness. I'm not sure how to I don't think these are good translations, but it's clearly itzavon is a version of etzev, but both of them are used there. chapter 3, verse 60. And this is Rashi's translation, based on the Midrash. What's itzavon? Zeh tsar gidul banim. This is the pain, the anguish of raising children. What can I say? This is what we don't want to publicize that there is any tsar in raising children. Ideally, there is no tsar in raising children. Ideally, we get what we reap what we sow. But it doesn't always feel like that. What is the trouble in raising children? What is the peculiar color of pain that has to do with raising children? And Rashi wants to try to differentiate it from, for instance, the pain of pregnancy, right? The difficulty of pregnancy. That's called heronech. And the etzev, in which you will give birth to children, that's the pain of childbirth. So he's not interested here in the actual physical difficulty of pregnancy and childbirth. That's that, right? Normally we think that's the only subject that is being dealt with here. No, he says there is a particular, and it comes first, there's a particular form of frustration, suffering that's involved in raising children. And it seems very clear that the pain of raising children is that you don't just create them at one fell swoop and say, right, tov ma'od, it's very good. But they raise themselves to some extent. They have what we call free will. That's a nice theological way of putting it. What it means is simply that they bring themselves into being, that there's a kind of inward, each child has their own process. And of course you can try to implant whatever word you want to use. You can nourish the child with all kinds of good things on every level. You can put in all the good ingredients, but there are no guarantees. And the reason for that there are no guarantees is because of the freedom and vitality of life. Because life forms itself. The form is not imposed on it from the beginning. There's always water there. There's always, right, if you're going to form a new human being, then there's always, right, what is the water? Right? Perhaps I'll just say the unconscious. What can't be consciously calculated? There is the parent's unconscious wishes. There's the child's growing unconscious. There's the whole environment, things that are not so easily identified, right? And they're not clear, right? That's why it's water, right? The depths, the idea of the depths that are beyond our clear detection. You know, it's not so easy to identify those depths. And so there you have, right? That's part of the curse. You have now, it's a curse, which is in a way a blessed curse. Because along with this comes freedom. It comes the freedom and the vitality, the liveliness of life. And then if you go to number 1c, right, the third passage in number 1, we're really dotting around here. When Noach is born, we're given the reason for his name. His father names him Noach. He said, Zeh yenachamenu, this one will comfort us. Me itzavon yadenu. This one will comfort us from, and there's that word, itzavon. That is, not only in the family is there itzavon, and not only in God's creation is there itzavon, and not only in the field, parnasah. You know, how are we going to live in the world? Economics. How are we going? Oh, not only there is there frustration and disappointment, somehow built into creativity. Right? There's something about our creativity, if it's a real creativity, that has to be open-ended. We can't actually seal all the exits. We can't actually make it surefire. Then it's not creative. Right? It's simply, that's just following a recipe. You follow the recipe, you've got it perfect. But the possibility of getting an extraordinary cake out of this, an extraordinary poem, comes from a certain kind of open-endedness. That to some extent, you allow what can't be known for sure to play a role. Right? Imagination, right? Certain kind of flexibility. And here, what you have is not only, here is Noach, according to Rashi, who is supposed to give us relief, Noach, Yaniach mimenu. He will give us relief. All human beings will get relief from the itzavon yadenu, the potential disappointment of our manual labor. That is, what can happen in manual when we use our hands. And here there's a very down-to-earth, literally down-to-earth understanding of what is it that Noach's father expected Noach to do. Why did he call him Noach? It's nothing to do with comfort. Again, the need to change the meaning of the words, right? Because if it had been comfort, then he should have been called Menachem, says Rashi, very rationally, yes? But he's called Noach. So forget about the meaning of Yenachamenu, the usual meaning, which is he will give us comfort. It has to mean Yaniach mimenu. Split up the word Yenachamenu, and you get Yaniach mimenu. He will give us ease, relief from the hard, thankless work of our hands. And here comes this wonderful interpretation. Till Noach came to the world, there were no clay machrisha. There were no plowing implements in the world. There was no plow. And therefore he had to do it. Every human beings had to work with their hands, as we said before. Now, there are some very fertile and wonderful comments in the Midrash that elaborate on this. For instance, in one comment, we're told that till Noach, the human hand was like a spade. There was no separation of fingers. In other words, isn't that just what anthropologists tell us? You can find from remains of unevolved man before the evolution of the human being, that the evolution of the full human being has to do with a separation. Has to do with the separation of fingers and the fact, therefore, that one can deal much more fully and much more powerfully with the world, deal with full force. Here it's called the invention of the plow. And the invention of the plow is not only now that Rashi doesn't talk about the separation of fingers. He talks about human ingenuity, technical ingenuity, that Noach was the person who would invent the plow. Now that's quite a leap. How is it that we suddenly get to the plow? He invented the plow, and the trouble of dealing with all the thorns and thistles was much alleviated in the time of Noach. Because what does the plow do? The plow extends the power of your hand, makes it much stronger and more impervious to overcome resistance, to overcome the resistance of the thorns and the thistles and the stones and all the obstacles that are there on the surface of the earth. And it gets in deep in the soil and brings up rich, soft earth from underneath. It covers over, buries the sterile ground, the surface of the earth, which was a real challenge for the human being till Noach came along. So here suddenly you have this spontaneous idea that Noach had something to do with plows. When it comes to the flood, have a look at number 3 on your page. Another comment that Rashi makes, I hope we begin to see how all this imagery begins to cohere, begins to come together. We read that chapter 6, verse 13, we read that God says, because of the evil of human beings, Hineni mashkitam et haaretz, I am going to destroy them with the earth. Does it mean with the earth? I'm going to destroy human beings. Have a look at Rashi. Rashi says, well, perhaps it just means, number 3, from the earth. And to give some examples where et can mean from the earth. I'm going to destroy the human being from the surface of the earth. But no, that is not good enough. So Rashi goes on to davar acher, to let his imagination, as it were, go, and to understand the full implications of destroying man with the earth. Im haaretz, that when the flood came, 3 tvachim of the depth of the plow, 3 handbreadths depth of the soil was dissolved, was turned into water, was turned into mush, Nitashtishu. Nitashtishu means was from lost its solid substance, not just the very surface of the earth, but 3 handbreadths down, which is the depth that the plow reaches to. So suddenly there's a kind of anti-plow. Instead of the plow that can bring things up, bring up the wet, soft soil so that there can be fertility, right? Fertile earth on top. What you have now is a flooding of water. You have a flooding of water which destroys that same depth. I'm calling it an anti-plow. I think you see what I mean. Yes. In other words, it's using in a way the givens of what a plow does in order to just flip it and to say it's the same water. And we're talking here about water, and water makes it fertile, and that's how the plow works. And overwatering, which is the mabul, destroys. I'm putting it a little crudely here. And with this, I think we're ready to come to number 4. Have a look at number 4, which is an extraordinary midrash about plows. It actually relates to a pasuk, a text about Yitzchak. When Yitzchak prayed to God for his barren wife, Rivka. You remember. And the word that's used for prayer there is vaye'etar Yitzchak. Yitzchak beseeched, ayin taf resh. It's an intense word for prayer. He deeply beseeched God, intensely beseeched God. So here in the Talmud in Yevamot, we have this. Why is the prayer of the righteous compared to an atar, ayin taf resh? And suddenly you have a play on words. Atar is a plow or a pitchfork, something that goes into the earth and turns over the soil, kind of circulates the depths of the soil so that there can be fertile soil on top, changes the surface. So you start off with a stony surface. Why is prayer compared to that? Now that's a loaded question. I didn't know prayer was compared to that. But once you read that Isaac's prayer, Yitzchak's prayer, is called Vaye'etar, then the Midrash can't not relate to the meaning of the word atar. Atar means that implement that turns things over, that in some way inverts things, takes things to their opposite. And so what do we have here? Why? Just as this plow, mahapech hatvua mimakom lemakom, turns over, overturns, subverts the produce, the hay, from one place to the other, vertically, right, or even horizontally. So the prayer of the righteous turns over, converts, inverts the attributes of God from the attribute of anger to the attribute of compassion. That is, a prayer is a plow. How does a prayer operate? You can't be more physical than this. You can't be more despiritualizing than this, right? We're not talking here in abstractions. We're talking about God the depths of his mind are stirred up so that they overcome the surface of his mind when a human being prays. It's like if someone asks us a human reaction. I may be very angry with you, but if someone comes and pleads with me, then what happens on some level is that I discover the depths of my own love for the person I'm angry with, and I somehow the surge of love that comes up and covers over and suppresses all that anger. And somewhere that's being used as a dynamic image here for how God is affected by prayer. It's like a plow. And the words here are ragzanut and rachmanut. The two opposites are anger and compassion. As if God has these two poles within himself, and he's not always decided, finally, that somewhere there is this and then there is that. When one is on top, right? It's a Kabbalistic way of figuring it. When one is on top, and we can relate to it, it's very human. When one is on top, then that's what it seems is going to happen. But we shouldn't give up, because there's always something else underneath. There is the unconscious. The unconscious is underneath. There is unconscious love. There's love that's not now being experienced, but is there. And a tefillah, the prayer of the righteous, can act like a plow. Joseph Mandelstam, the great Russian poet, talked about poetry in this mode. Poetry is a plow. I'd like to read you the sentence. It's so evocative. We're dealing in the elements here. We're dealing with elemental things. Yes, poetry, he says, is the plow tearing open and turning over time, so that the deep layer of it, its rich black undersoil, ends up on the surface. Mankind craves like a plowman for the virgin soil of time. That is, the poet can't tolerate the well-used, banal surface of things, the uncreative, unfertile state of language, modern language. And sometimes there's a need to enrich the language by going into the past, right, plowing down into the past and bringing up a richer language, a language that will give vitality and unexpectedness and double meanings to the plain, prosaic language of the surface. And that is the effect of prayer too. It brings up resources that are there, but there has to be a kind of act of subversion, right? It's almost what's the word I want? It's against the law of surfaces. It works against the law of obvious meanings. You know, it's common sense. That's what's there on the surface. And it says, yes, but there is something else. And then there is a hipuch, and there's a changing of places. Instead of din, there is rachamim. The word for din in the Midrash is ragzanut, right? It's really much more human. It's not a matter of judgment, it's a matter of anger. That's what midat hadin is. Midat hadin is the attribute of God that is displeased. Sometimes looks at the reality and says, no, lo tov. This is not good. Rak ra kol hayom. And it's an emotional reaction. It's an emotional reaction before God actually describes the evil. He's just vayichatzev, vayinachem. It's not, this is not good. And in this sense, the prayers of the righteous have this capacity to turn things over. There is a fascinating issue that was brought up by Darwin that I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about because I find it so interesting. Darwin wrote early in his writing career a book called On the Formation of Mold. And this was a book in which he argued, this was at around the time he was beginning to bring back all his great discoveries and observations about the origin of the species. At the same time, he wrote this book about the activity of worms. I'm going to try to say this very, very quickly. That the activity of worms in the soil are a kind of natural plow. Before man invented the plow, the worms did the work. And we're talking here about earthworms who can change entirely, right? That kind of revolutionary effect of hundreds and thousands within any square meter. There are thousands. I've got the figures all written down here. People did a lot of, Darwin himself did a lot of research. How many thousands of worms are to be found in a square acre? And they are constantly, reliably working away to consume, right? To consume the earth and to excrete it on the surface. So that they're constantly putting fresh, right? They're putting fertile, soft earth on the surface. And sometimes, there are figures here, in 12 to 13 Let me see, I've got some figures here that I can actually make out. In 18 years, Darwin observed that there were 12 to 13 inches of new earth that had been deposited on top of a very crusty, dry, strewn with objects layer of earth, which had been the surface. And that's how the earth regenerates itself. It's all done by the lowly worm, by this little creature. This is actually what offers hope to the world. It becomes an image of hope, this natural plow, the worm. Al tir'i tolat Yaakov. Remember in Yeshayahu? Don't be afraid, you worm. Right? Israel, Yaakov is called a worm. Well, that doesn't sound flattering. In Christian iconography and in Jewish iconography, of course, the idea of the worms also have very deathly connotations, but not this one. This one is the kind, Tolat Yaakov, what does Rashi say there about the worm who is Jacob Israel? She'en gvurato ela bapeh, whose power, whose might is only in its mouth. Now look what a grotesque, wonderful image. The power of the worm is entirely in its mouth. In other words, if you want to be a little less elegant about it, in its digestive system, that the worm consumes, digests, excretes, and that's its power. It can transform the whole surface. It can renew the whole surface. And so if you have that kind of power with your mouth, what would that mean? With your mouth would mean, in that sense, tefillah, according to the plain meaning of the Midrash. The power to use language transformatively, to remind God, as it were, of another layer of truth. And in that sense, we're all like worms. And so what seems to matter is not so much the action of any one particular worm, because that's minuscule, but the fact that there is such a mass of worms jumping away at the same time. Don't let this go too far, but there is this sense somewhere of a mass of unrecognized glory of what's going on under the earth that has to do with this transformative power. And with this, then, we come to Noach. What do we have then with Noach? Noach is the person who doesn't say a word. Have you noticed? In the course of the whole story, God speaks to him and he doesn't answer. The only words he will speak at the very end, after the flood is over, is when he blesses and curses his children. He has something to say about his children. That's what really gets to him in the end. But when God tells him, I'm going to destroy the whole world, you make an ark and go into it with your immediate family and leave everyone else to die, and with 2 specimens, male and female, of animals, or 7. Noach says not a word. He has nothing to say about it. What might he have said? And the Zohar is very clear about it. The Zohar reads Noach really against the grain of the text, because in the text we get the impression that Noach is exemplary. Vaya'as Noach ka'asher tziva oto Elokim. Twice we read it. Noach did exactly what God commanded him. So he's very obedient. He's a good person. Isn't that the ideal? Total obedience. And the Zohar says no, that there were other things he should have been saying, he should have been doing. That is, he might, for instance, have been protesting, somehow drawing people's attention to the fact that there's a flood going to be. Did he do that? There's no evidence in the text. Or protesting to God. In other words, praying. He could have been using his koach bapeh, which apparently is very weak in him, to say something to God. And instead, there's a kind of absence of that koach. There's a kind of flaccidity. He doesn't have that kind of conviction. So the way the Zohar puts it is very strongly, very, very powerfully, compares this to Moshe. God says to Moshe, V'ata hanichali, right, after the sin of the golden calf, Now just let me alone. Don't interrupt me. Don't bother me, and I will destroy the whole people. And I'll make you into a replacement people, substitute nation. In the Zohar, Moshe's answer to that is, if I do that, then people will say, I am like Noah, who destroyed the whole world. It's put very forcefully. A negative becomes a positive because he didn't speak. So if I obey you and just let you be and don't say a word, then I have a model for that. And it's not a good model. Right? In the view of the Midrash, in the perspective of the Zohar, that's a negative model. And notice, of course, the pun. Did you see it? Va'ata hanichali. Now let me be, and the Zohar reads it, Noach mi. Noach hanichali. As if God is saying to Moshe, provocatively, let's see if you are going to enact Noach now. Are you going to do what Noach does? It looks as if I'm commanding you to do that. But actually, by using the word Noach, I'm evoking in you your resistance to that role. Right? If you can hear me properly, you understand that Noach is not really in favor. That's not the ideal model, and that's not who I want to be. Now, for Noach, there is no sense, apparently, that something is called on him to do here that is not exactly doing what God commands him. And he, step by step, he does exactly what God says. V'Hashem sagar ba'ado. He goes into the ark, into that box, and a God closed it behind him. And there he is in a closed teva, in a closed box, in a closed word, if you will. God said, Bo el hateva, come into that box. A year later, and we're not given access to Noach's trauma. We don't hear at all what he suffered during that year. What do we hear in the Midrash, not in the text? The only thing we hear about God, about Noach and his feelings and his activities really, is that he was very good about feeding the animals, that he was zan umufarnes, that he played almost a godlike role there, that he was so particular and conscientious about feeding each animal according to the time schedule that the animal likes to be fed. Right? That's the way Midrashim will put it. It's almost whimsical, right? The feeling of he had no thought for himself. He ran around from one animal to the next, filling the timetable according to the animal's need. He didn't sleep a wink, says the Midrash. He didn't, no sleep at all. A difficult life he had in there. Do we hear that he's suffering? The Midrash doesn't emphasize suffering. It emphasizes what? What was Noah's role there inside the ark? And we can learn something about this from the Midrash that you can see if we look at number 8. I'm sorry, number 7. Number 7. It's written in Kohelet, there is a time for everything and a season for everything under the heavens.
Yeah.
As it says, what's the example of this famous statement in Kohelet? God says to Noah, come into the ark. Bo ata v'chol beitcha el hateva. Come with your whole household into the ark. But there was a time for him to leave the ark. Right? There was a time to enter and there was a time to leave. When God, zman haya lo sheyetze mimena, as it says, tzeh min hateva. God speaks to him at the end of the year and says to him, now leave the ark. What is this like? It's like a governor and administrator who left the place, went out of his place, his palace, his administrative mansion. He left his place and he settled someone else to substitute for him. He was no longer in place, so he had a replacement. And then the time came when the governor came and said, leave your place to the substitute, meaning the place you got used to thinking of as yours, because it's really mine. Instead of saying leave my place, it's leave your place. I know that you are quite comfortable there by now. And what happens then? You could skip a line. There's a little difficulty here with the text. Lo kibel alav. When God said leave the ark, Noah didn't agree to leave. He didn't want to leave. Now, how do we know this? That there's some reluctance on Noah's part to go out of the ark. And it's a subtle suggestion that has really got quite wide evidences for it. It's quoted in many places. Going into the ark means separating from your wife and your son separating from their wives. In other words, being one of the things that is meant by being in the ark is no sexual relations, no language, right? Sexuality is also a language. No communication on that very deep level between male and female. And this will apply to all the animals and all human beings, right? This is a very strong, right, hidden level, repressed level of the narrative. When God says, leave the ark, what he means is you and your wife, and he spells it out. Unlike the terms of going into the ark, which was you and your sons. Right? There it was, you and your sons and your wife and the daughters. Sex is separated. But when it comes to leaving the ark, you and your wife. And in other words, clearly hinting, if there's such a thing as a clear hint, hinting that there is to be a reunion of the sexes, that dibur has talking, speech, language between those who are not the same as you, that you can't entirely control, right? Male and female are the classic war, right? It's the classic sense of two who are not the same and who have to learn somehow each other's timing, each other's way of talking, each other's way of being, right? Starting from the body, right? The body and the emotions, a certain sense of rhythm. And God is saying, get back together with your wife. And what do we read? Noah leaves with his sons and his wife with the daughters. There is on a level here in which he doesn't want to give up the condition of the box. And the understanding, I think, in our midrash here is that it's because the box, the sense, is like a mini version. It's a model of God in the world. Here in the box in the Teva, Noah was playing God. Noah was the one who fed all the animals, Zan U'Mefarnes. Like God, he doesn't sleep. Like God, he has no relationships, right, of this kind. In other words, he is playing God in ways that are, in a way, admirable. Certainly, there seems to be a lack of self-indulgence here. But the one thing he has is a kind of omnipotence. And omnipotence apparently makes it worthwhile for him. He's not so quick to want to leave. To enter into a relationship with his wife again would mean giving up on that omnipotence. You can no longer be God if you are engaged in that kind of, you begin to recognize gaps and distances and things that have to be engaged with. And so really Noah is making clear that he wants to remain silent. He doesn't want actually to speak at all. Now I'd like to look back at number 6 with you. That pasuk that we looked at before about the vegetation on the earth, the power of prayer, right? This plow-like power of prayer. What is the power of prayer? It says in the verse number 6 that there was no vegetation, terem yitzmach. It was before any vegetation had grown. And here Rashi comments, it doesn't say before the vegetation had grown. It means, terem means not yet. Not yet means that we're expecting the vegetation because that's what God had commanded. But for some reason, it's stalled. Terem, it should be there, coming up from the surface of the earth. And for some reason, it's not there. Why is it not there? Well, Rashi spells it out here. Adayin lo, not yet. That is, when God said on the third day, he said on the third day, let the earth bring forth its vegetation. Vegetation grew up to the opening of the earth, of the soil, as it were. It grew just to the pores of the earth and didn't emerge, didn't actually rise up from the surface of the earth. What is it waiting for? It's waiting for the rain. But before there can be rain, it's a kind of chain reaction. Before there can be rain, there has to be a human being who is oved, who works, a human being who uses his powers of language to pray to God, to recognize what should be, betovatam shel geshamim, or in the words of a parallel version of this in the Gemara in Chulin, someone to mevakesh rachamim, to recognize a contorted, paralyzed state of things, that things are being held back here, that there's no, the fertility of the soil is not working as it should. It's being repressed, and there is a need now that the human being will have to pray for rain. And then Adam came. When Adam was created, then he knew that the rain is necessary for the world and the vegetation is necessary for the world. And so he prayed for the rain, and the rain descended. And then the trees grew. The trees and the vegetation broke through the surface of the earth. So it's a very detailed description of the power of prayer. Right? There is the mouth of the earth, as it were, which closes on the vegetation until the human being opens his mouth and finds a way of communicating beyond these sterile opposites, of going beyond his fear of generation, in fact. And that's the way it's put, actually, in the end of the Midrash in number 7. Why does Noah refuse to leave the ark, that is, to reunite with his wife? He can't trust that the children who will be born will not again be drowned in another flood. In other words, he fears the whole process of generation, the whole process of going beyond your comfort zone, going beyond where you can be sure, and recognizing the relationship with the other, the relationship with, in this case, of man and woman, and taking the risk of having children, because we can never be sure. There's always the possibility of itzavon, at the least, of failed creativity. Not daring to do what goes beyond a certain kind of depressive state. As if Noach here is in a kind of depressive state. Julia Kristeva, the great European philosopher, spends essentially a whole book called Black Sun, S-U-N, writing about depression. And in what she has to say about depression, she talks about a state in which, and she sees it in analysis when she has patients in analysis, in which people talk in a stalled kind of way. They can't discover the fertility of language. Language is somehow cramped in their way of talking. They can't really speak. And her diagnosis has to do with the depression of someone who can't agree to lose, who can't agree that part of the process of life is the risk of losing. The risk of losing. If I don't agree to lose mother, she uses the Freudian model here, that the young child has to in some way consent to moving away from the mother, to losing the mother and taking the risk of its own creativity in the world, in some kind of fantasy of the presence of the mother. If I do not agree to lose mother, I could neither imagine nor name her. It's only through loss that we begin actually to have a conception in our minds of what it is that we want and need, what should be there. And then we can name what we want, and we can talk about it, and we can desire it. Desire is born, and we can act so as to help the desire come into the world. So the psychoanalytic analysis here of what is going on with such patients, with depressed patients, I think applies very well to Noach. Noach is someone who can't tolerate that insult to his omnipotence that has to do with renewing relations with his wife, with returning to the risks of the world outside the box, the world outside the teva. And so he doesn't pray. There's no evidence that he prays to get out of here, which is surprising after all. Even Yonah prays, and Yonah has his own problems. But he prays from the belly of the whale, if you remember. By the time he is imprisoned in that marine reality, he does pray to God. What do we have here, however? The Midrash can't accept that Noah really doesn't pray. On the one hand, it seems clear that he really doesn't. There's no mention of it. And yet, have a look at number 8. God says, God speaks, Vayidaber Elokim el Noach, Tse min hateva. God speaks to Noah, and the word ledaber is very forceful. It's the first time that the word has been used, actually. The word God speaks, not just Vayomer, but Vayidaber. He's trying to teach Noah something. Tse min hateva. Do leave the ark. And immediately after this, the Midrash quotes from a different text from Sefer Yeshayahu, the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah gives us a prayer, Hotzi'ah mimasger nafshi. Please release my soul, my whole being, my nefesh, that is my life force, my body, mind, soul combination. Release it from prison, masger. There is the word masger that for the Midrash evokes how God closed Noach into the ark. V'Hashem sagar ba'ado. That is, for a year, Noach has to be in a closed situation with no access to all that water which has become destructive in the world. So instead of being destroyed in the water, he is in a dry, he's home and dry in the teva, but that dryness can only be a temporary condition. And there comes a moment where God says, with equal force, with which he said, go into that place, go out of the waters, leave the danger of the waters. With equal force, God says, leave the teva at this point. And here the Midrash imagines a prayer in the mouth of Noah. That he prays to God, please release my life from imprisonment, lehodot et shemcha, so that I may give thanks to your name. It's as if suddenly he has a desire, Hotzi'ah mimasger nafshi. And here the Midrash continues, that hayas sagur b'teva, Yud Bet Chodesh. He was 12 months shut up in that ark, closed in that ark. And closed in, I think, has all that meaning of not just that the door was closed, but that there is some kind of inner closedness, that inwardly he is unable to do this elemental act of lehodot et shemcha, or what comes before it, which is simply to ask God for freedom, to ask God to release his spirit, to release him into words. It's as if what he really wants on some level is two opposite things. On the one hand, he doesn't want to speak. He's very firmly walled up against speech. Silence is somewhere safer than speech. And on the other hand, there had to have been a prayer, let me go, let me out of this. And the idea would be, by quoting that text from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah, it wouldn't be just the physical release from the teva to go onto dry land, right? That would be the facts of the matter, the plot, but an inner release from that closed situation, which doesn't allow him really to connect to God at all. So that he's living in some sense in a non-traumatic existence inside. Who is suffering trauma in this story? It's God who's suffering trauma. God is the one who doesn't anymore have a belief in the world. Right? And God is the one, and here, if I'm going to turn the screw, one more turn, it's quite extraordinary note that the Orach Chaim makes. 18th century, very important commentary. He says, Noah doesn't pray, but you can't say that God made it easy for him to pray. After all, God said to Noah, Ketz kol basar ba lefanai.
That's on wheels, sweetie. Or something.
Someone needs to mute, I think. God said to Noah, go into the ark, because the end of all flesh has come up before me. In other words, it's the end. There is nothing you can do about it. That's not what God said to Moshe. With Moshe, God actually invited Moshe
For some reason.
to pray by saying, Va'ata hanichali, now just let me alone. Right? Why would God say, let me alone, if there weren't an alternative? Right? And the imagination of the human being should be released by that. Really what God wants is that I shouldn't let him alone. There's a certain freedom here of creativity that God is calling on with Moshe. But with Noah, God didn't do that. And the Orach Chaim says, it's quite harsh. He says, it caused me a lot of trouble, this. Hashem satam et tfilato. That really God blocked Noah's prayer by saying, it's the end, don't even try. Just walk into the ark, you and your family, don't even speak. And I've really puzzled over this notion that it's not only Noah as a, let's say, a pathological reaction to the over-speaking and over-connectivity of his generation. They are full of sexual relationships of all kinds, completely perverse and unlimited kinds. Right? That's that znut, androlamusia, the sense of chaos. And that's why chaos through water comes to the world. Noah, it isn't just that he opts for silence and dryness and not being with his wife, but in a sense, God is indicating to him, it's really indicating quite strongly that there can be no prayer, that there's something here, there's a moment in the reality of the world in which there can be no prayer. But when God suggests to Noah, leave the ark, that would have been the moment for Noah to begin to pray, at least at that point. And what the Midrash gives us, therefore, is that sense of Hotzia b'masker nafshi, that he must have cried out to God, please release me in order to give thanks. That is, it's not so much that I want to walk off the gangplank of this box, but I want to release my power of language, which has been in a way crushed in this interval. Have a look at the Sfatimet in number 9. Same in Hateva. And the Sfatimet says here, Hotziyam imasker nafshi lehodot et shemcha. He quotes that pasuk from the Midrash from Yeshayahu. And he says this, all the 7 days in the Beit HaMikdash, the gates were closed. And only on the 7th day it was opened up. Why? Because in the human reality, our inner intense world, the inner world of the human being, the spiritual world, is in some sense closed in. Yesh zmanim. There are times when the gates of heaven are opened. And so it is also here in the lower worlds, that the hearts of human beings who are engaged in worship of God also are opened in order so that human beings can give thanks, can pray and can give thanks, can notice what is needed and ask for it, can plow the earth can bring out other dimensions of reality aside from anger and closure. Human beings can do that sometimes, at other times we can't. It's as if there's a kind of periodicity, there's a kind of a movement in time. For instance, it's impossible, he puts it very strikingly, very strongly, it's impossible to give thanks and praise to God at all times. It isn't there are times when it's impossible to give praise and thanks to God. Why? Because the human being, he says, lo hametim hallelujah, because we contain in ourselves death. We contain in ourselves the awareness of death, sometimes even the death wish, right? The fear of death, and something about that makes it impossible for us to connect with God at all times. When can we connect with God? Tov l'hodot l'Hashem. When? On Shabbat, for instance. On Yom Tov. That is, there are certain moments when the gates get opened. It doesn't mean that at other moments we don't try and we don't ask to pray. I think it's like praying to pray. But there are times when it comes easily, when suddenly the gates are opened, and they are the gates of heaven on the one hand, but they are the gates of the human heart on the other. That the human heart also has its seasons. It has its times for being inward and then for opening out. What is needed then? What can we say? What is needed then in the end with this story? In the end, God says, I'm never going to do this again. I am never going to bring a flood on the world. And here is God then again in a very human mode. Right? The idiom is lo osif lekalel. I will no longer, from now on, all the forms and structures of existence in the world will never totally be destroyed. And that is not only in terms of space, but in terms of time, the seasons, summer, winter, spring, everything will have its time and will have its season. And God swears, according to the Midrash, Nishba, he actually swears that he's never going to bring the world in the same way to this kind of watery, this kind of deconstructed end in which there are no meanings left accessible at all. This oath of God is apparently instigated by a sweet smelling sacrifice that Noach makes when he comes out of the ark. Right, where I'm just trying to finish now. When he comes out of the ark, he makes a sacrifice, a korban olah, and God smells the sweet savor and he says, I will never again. And he says it twice, and that's an oath. Right? So now we've got it clear. Does Noach know about God's oath? God says it to his heart. Vayomer Hashem el libo. It's like God being sad to his heart at the beginning of the flood, but now God is talking to his heart. God is in dialogue with his own heart here. And he is saying there will never again be he's setting up a relationship with the different parts of himself, as it were, with the complexity of himself. Does Noach know about this oath? And here you have in the Mea Shiloach, in the last source on your page, Hine zot machshevet Hashem yitbarach. This was the thought of God. It was in the inner mind of God, but it was known to Noach. Noach does know that God has made this oath. How? God didn't tell him. God said it to his own heart. But since Noach himself had experienced as a result of the flood what's called yirah, godel ha'yirah, that is a sense of, not exactly fear, it's a sense of not expanding oneself arrogantly over everything, of somehow recognizing limits in one's ways of connecting to with the world, even in one's language. That language also has to have words that are recognizable, certain limits. Once man deeply begins to recognize that yirah in himself, no longer to be mitpashet, no longer to be imperiously conquering and governing all the forces of the world, then he understands how the Mea Shiloach puts it wonderfully. The human being then realizes, Ki ken hu gam ken ritzon Hashem yitbarach. Once I recognize something in myself, a certain emotional movement in myself, which it comes from very deep, then I understand that this must correspond to something in God. That is, that there is a deep connection between God's movement, the movement of God's state of connection with himself, and the human being's state of connection. so that human beings can, in the end, what emerges from this in the end is the human being who, in her own deep experience, begins to create a connection with God that simply hadn't been there before. It's no longer a question of God's omnipotence coming and bringing a flood, but human beings recognizing that the flood comes from me. That is, that the flood is there in my own human life, in my relations with others, in lack of discrimination, in lack of, and a certain kind of inward work in the human being then results in a kind of intuition about God. That one's way of constructing, of creating a sense of God comes even before God has spoken. It comes from a certain intuition. Right? In the end, everyone will know that God made this oath because God will dictate it to Moshe. It'll be part of the Torah and we'll read about it. We'll read about the oath. Did Noach know? You might think he didn't know, but the Me'er Shalach said, yes, he did. That he did because of this new intimate level of work with which Noach begins to know himself as a result of the trauma, if you will, that he takes on himself, imaginatively, something of the trauma of the creative person, the creative God, right? The creative God who takes the risk of the world, frustrating one, and then continues to dedicate himself, to commit himself to life, to commit himself to the life of the world, in a way affirming a kind of erotic connection with the world that will no longer be subject to what do you call it when there's a ketzer, you know, in English, the fuse, right? The electrical impulses will no longer be subject to fuses, right? And these electrical impulses are viewed here both from the inner world of God and the inner world of the human being. We really, in this story, I would have to say, are more interested in the inner world of God, right? Because the inner world of Noach is really not shared with us. We have very little access to his feelings during this whole story. All we know about him is that he doesn't say anything. Right? It's through God's inner world, as most unusual, of course, it's through God's inner world that we begin to understand what will allow that oath to be, right, to become relevant in the world. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
I'm afraid I've gone on over time. I will read it. I'll read your comments in chat, and look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you very much.
Wow.
Thank you. Yashikar.
Thank
That
you.
was excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to see you, Avivah.
Muted.
Good to
I
see
have
you.
to-
Very lovely to see you all. I'm very happy to see you.
Many thanks. Wonderful.
What?
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Hi, Avivah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Hi, Dr. Zornberg. I wrote you in the chat when you were talking about improving and creation.
Yes.
And so it made me think of May Shafir. I learned it this week. I never realized it's Lishaper and about Shifra and Pua. So it helps what you were saying.
Very nice. Very beautiful. In fact, beautiful. Shifra. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's that idea of beauty, the dimension of beauty.
Yes, and of improvement, of how we can, you know,
Yes.
being born and creation and creating.
Yes.
So.
Yes. Yes. And in a way, trauma, that's what trauma asks for. Trauma asks for healing. Right? In a sense, if we don't have the trauma, then we don't have the healing. Right?
Can I ask if your course tomorrow is going to be the
Yes,
same?
It's basically the same, but it's never the same. So
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
I mean,
Thank you.
I'm not, you know.
It was great.
I'm not
Always.
advertising. Yes.
Thank you. Laila Tov.
Laila.
Bye.
So thank you.
Thanks, Avivah.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
What a pleasure. Yes.
Can I ask how you decided to focus around trauma and healing this year? Why that was your theme for,
Um,
because of Corona or?
no, obviously it has relevance, but obviously. But it's something I've been thinking about, and it always amazes me how often you find in the commentaries, particularly on Sefer Bereshit and Shemot, this theme of trauma, as I want to elaborate on it as we go on. Yes. They use words that are exactly what the modern trauma experts use. Yes, it's not just pain. There is something else meant by trauma. Call to.
Too.
Avivah, hello, are you there?